Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, I guess good evening from some of the friends in Europe. Thank you for joining USDM's Best Practice Series webinar. My name is Jim McDonald. I'll be helping on our webinar today with Jay Crowley, USDM's Vice President and UDI Practice Lead. Today's topic is UDI Challenges and Opportunities. As many of you know, Jay worked for the FDA for 27 years. He helped develop the framework for the UDI Unique Device Identification System and authored the UDI Final Rule. Jay also led the team responsible for the development and implementation of the UDI requirements and the registration database. Within USDM Life Sciences, Jay focuses on helping companies achieve UDI Final Rule compliance, and we're also starting to work with some clients on how they can achieve business benefits in addition to compliance. Just a few notes on USDM before we start. We are a consulting firm focused exclusively in the life science domain. We're headquartered in California. We've done projects for over 300 different life science companies, mostly in the U.S. We're now beginning to do some additional work in Europe and in Asia. A couple of key points. In addition to our UDI practice, which is listed alphabetically at the end of our list, we have extensive capabilities across a number of service areas and applications. The bottom bullet item on the second column talks about a new application we're offering, which we just demonstrated at a conference last week, and that's called UDI Connect. That's a mobile application for on-demand access to the data attributes in the FDA's Good ID. So that may be something that we can talk about individually with each of you going forward. A little bit on the logistics. The webinar is 60 minutes in length. We will cover content for about 45 minutes, then invite you to post questions on the chat box. You can do that during the session. We will try and save these questions for the end of the presentation. If, in fact, we don't get to all of the questions, you can shoot us an email or a note, post a note at usdm@usdm.com, and we will try and answer those as well. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Jay.
Hey, Jim, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone as well. Thank you all for joining us, and Jim, thanks for that introduction. As Jim mentioned, we're going to try to go with about 45 minutes of content here and leave some time for questions. Do feel free to post questions during the presentation, and Jim, if one seems relevant as we're rolling along, please feel free to interject, and we'll see if we can get it answered on the fly. You can see the agenda items there. We're going to talk primarily about what we have seen, both work that we have done with individual manufacturers as they have moved to implement UDI, and conversations that we've had with many folks at different companies as they're moving through their UDI program planning and implementation. So we're not really going to talk so much about the UDI rule. Hopefully everyone is generally familiar with the regulation, and we have a series of webinars that we've done previous that you can find on our website where we talk about the rule and various aspects of it. But here we're really going to talk more broadly about what it means for an organization, or more specifically some of the issues and challenges that we've seen for an organization as they have ramped up for UDI implementation. Many of these are not issues directly related to UDI. In fact, I might argue that none of them are directly related to UDI. They are issues that existed prior to UDI, but UDI has sort of forced companies to come to grips with some of these issues, or UDI has shown a light on certain activities that one needs to kind of work around, get their arms around as you try to move to UDI, actual UDI implementation. So that's going to be most of what we're talking about. You can see there's a couple of other agenda items. We'll talk about barcode verification as well, another one of the issues that sort of comes as a shock to folks moving forward. We'll talk about, as Jim mentioned already, the Good ID, the Global Unique Device Identification Database, FDA's database where device identifiers and metadata are stored, and some of the issues and challenges that manufacturers face as they move towards actually getting that data ready and getting it submitted to FDA. We'll talk briefly about program planning, program auditing as well. So this is an opportunity for those manufacturers who have developed their UDI program, have implemented it or are starting to implement it depending on your device risk classes, and are starting to think now about how well was this done, are there any holes, maybe this is a time to take a step back and to review your UDI implementation and to assess whether any mid-course corrections are necessary. And finally, we'll wrap it up with a little summary and then shoot into the questions and answers. So with that, hopefully this is working for everyone. I'm moving now to what is slide 7 in our presentation deck, and hopefully everyone is with me. Briefly, hopefully folks are fairly familiar with this. This is the timeline for UDI. As you can see, a lot of work has gone into the development of the UDI rule. It took essentially a decade to develop and finally published, as you can see there in the third bullet from the bottom, on September 24th of 2013, and that then began the implementation timeframes that we'll touch on in a moment. This continues. I hope everyone on the phone, everyone listening in, or anyone watches later understands that UDI is a work in progress. Right? This is a brand new activity from a regulatory perspective, and work continues. Work continues with individual manufacturers. Work continues at the standards organizations, the accredited issuing agencies. Work continues at FDA, and probably most importantly, work continues globally. So you can see there in December of 2013, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, published an update to a guidance that had been published in September of the previous year. And that guidance provides a framework for regulators globally as they develop their UDI regulations. And we are starting now to see other countries begin the process of developing their own UDI or UDI-like systems. So if you are a global manufacturer, I encourage you to keep an eye out for these activities and stay tuned in to what is actually going on. We will see some minor differences, I'm sure. Hopefully they are minor for most manufacturers, but we will see differences, and we need to understand and appreciate that as these regulations and other kinds of activities take place in other countries through other regulators. And you can see there a guidance document that FDA updated, and I'm sure at some point in the future we'll probably see some more information come out about Good ID as FDA continues to improve how the database operates and to move forward with changes as new issues arise. For those of you who haven't seen, a couple of weeks ago, I don't have the exact date, I'm sorry, but FDA turned on, if you will, or made public the information in the Good ID. So you can go to FDA's UDI website, and there's a link actually to a National Library of Medicine website that houses the public access to the Good ID. So you can go in and look and see the data that's been submitted to date, primarily for Class 3 devices. And it's a very useful way to get a sense of what that data looks like as you're moving towards understanding your own data needs. Moving on now to slide 8, I want to take a half a step back so that we can take a couple steps forward and want to draw folks' attention to a couple of issues here. As you're moving through the development and implementation of your own UDI program, it's critical to understand the intent of the rule, why FDA undertook this activity, and really what Congress intended, or at least what FDA's understanding of Congress's intent was in the development of the UDI rule. And I draw your attention there. You can see in red in the middle. This is the implementing legislation, right? So it's not a whole lot of words, but these are the words that Congress gave FDA the mandate to go forth and develop a UDI system. And we can see there that the UDI is intended to identify the device through distribution and use. So this is over, if you will, the entire life cycle of the device. This is not just a supply chain issue. This doesn't end at some sort of loading dock. The UDI is intended to identify that device through its use. So whatever that looks like, use might be a single use and be done, or use might be a device that has a very long life and gets reused, over its entire lifespan. And so it's imperative that as you're thinking about implementing UDI for various finished devices, components, accessories, we'll get into that later, that you understand that UDI needs to identify that device over its entire life cycle. And that whatever you do, however you decide to do that, that it is meeting this congressional intent, or legislative intent, I should say, that's in the implementing legislation. And sort of teeing off that, we can see that there are a whole host of benefits. Obviously, there's a lot of public health benefits that can come about as we begin to develop and implement UDI. But what I really want to do, and hopefully all of this is fairly self-evident, but what I really want to do is to draw your attention to what was, at least when I was there, and what I still believe is FDA's intent or objective with the development of unique device identification. Why did FDA go through all of this hassle? It was a lot of work. It's a lot of work for FDA. It's a lot of work for device manufacturers. What is sort of the net of this whole conversation? And it really is, from FDA's perspective at least, focused very heavily on post-market surveillance. So the ability for FDA, or more specifically FDA's Device Center, to really more efficiently and effectively conduct post-market surveillance. The identification of signals in adverse events, the ability to aggregate that data into information that can be used to understand what's going on, and then in the case of a recall, be able to much more efficiently and effectively conduct recalls. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I'm sure people understand that conducting device recalls can be very difficult. And then the documentation of device use in other information systems, as you can see listed there. And this is also really brought to light in CDRH's post-market surveillance plan, published last year. And you can see central to that, hopefully everyone can see the slides, central to that is really UDI and the incorporation of UDI in electronic information systems. So that as the core, as the center to a whole host of post-market surveillance activities that you can see listed there around the periphery of the circle. So that whole UDI, documentation of UDI, becomes central to all of the future post-market surveillance activities that the center and other researchers, including manufacturers, hope to conduct. So again, going back to the intent, going back to the legislative intent, it's imperative that the UDI that you apply to your device is there to support all of these activities, support the identification of the device throughout its life cycle, and then whatever potential other activities take place, such as recalls, that the UDI is available at the appropriate level to conduct the kinds of activities that need to be conducted. With that, moving on to slide 12, this is the implementation timeframe, the compliance timeframe. Hopefully everyone is familiar with this, but September 24th of 2014, the Class 3 devices and the devices licensed under the PHS Act were subject, any device that went into commercial distribution after that date was subject to UDI. Coming up this year, we have what we call the FDASIA devices because they were mandated in FDA Safety and Innovations Act. Primarily Class 2 implants, so any device that FDA considers an implant. as well as any device that FDA considers life-supporting or life-sustaining. FDA recently published, and there's a list that FDA recently published, that by product code lists those devices that we believe, that FDA believes, are subject to the 2015 date. So we'll talk more about this in a moment, but it's therefore imperative that you understand for your devices what the associated correct product code is, so that you can determine whether, at least for those Class 2 devices, whether it's, or primarily Class 2 devices, whether it's this year or next year, so 2016 for those Class 2 devices that are not by product code associated with 2015. And then finally, we roll into Class 1 devices in 2018. So phased implementation, a lot of reasons for phased implementation, but part of it is to share learnings that go on as we move from one compliance deadline to the next. Moving on to slide 13, just an update to something I mentioned before, or a little bit more information, on something I mentioned before, which is a lot of activity going on around global UDI adoption. China is very active. We hope to see something from them soon. We're told regulations out of Europe by the end of this calendar year. Singapore's active. A number of other Asian countries are also active. Canada has indicated their desire to develop a UDI system built upon the IMDRF guidance. So we see a lot of activity. And the goal, the hope, is that all of this is globally harmonized, that it follows the sort of essential requirements that are described in the IMDRF guidance. I do want to, though, highlight two issues. One is around the data. Obviously, different countries are going to come up with different data needs. One of the things that we see associated with UDI implementation in other countries is that they are, at the same time that they're developing UDI, they're often, or implementing UDI, they're often trying to solve other problems, issues, business cases, use cases at the same time. So for example, out of Europe, we see a lot of focus not just on device identification vis-a-vis UDI, but on traceability. So requirements for stakeholders to manage device, explicit requirements for all the stakeholders in the supply chain to manage that device at a UDI level. And we're going to see similar things in other countries. So the UDI is there to solve, amongst other things, specific problems or specific business cases that these countries have. So you need to understand that as this moves forward, there will be additional requirements typically associated with UDI. And so as a corollary to that, we also see, or I think understand, that different countries will have their own UDI databases, and that though we hope that the core data elements, the UDI or the device identifier and the brand name and those kinds of things that are hopefully the same, they will have additional data elements. There's country-specific registrations, country-specific representatives. There will be country-specific data elements. So all of that as a build-up to whatever good ID solution you have or are putting in place, make sure that it's flexible and extensible, assuming again that you are distributing in countries other than the U.S., that it is extensible to allow you to add additional data elements and be able to submit that data in whatever form or format that country ends up developing. This will end up being a very critical component of your UDI system, your own internal UDI program and system, that you have that ability to do that. So that's it on the global UDI. I've got one last slide here on sort of the background of UDI. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, this is a label that we can see that has what we would consider to be a UDI barcode in the center there, that one long linear barcode. This is a UDI built according to the GS1 standards, and if we can read the text, the human readable text, plain text, the HRI under the barcode, we can see that there's a parenthetical 01, 14 digits that follows. That's the device identifier. And if we were to type those numbers in, which I can't even read on my screen, into FDA's good ID, that device identifier, that 14-digit device identifier, and assuming this is a Class 3 product, we would find information, the metadata that Medtronic submitted for that product. We can also see, if we look up by the red letter A, we can see an expiration date and serial number. And if we look then in the barcode, we see that there is a parenthetical 17, which tells us what follows is the expiration date, and then a parenthetical 21, which tells us the information that follows is the serial number. And I think you can see how that all matches up. So that's UDI on the label. We also see by the expiration date symbol, the little hourglass used by, we can see 2016-07-12, which is the standardized date format. So again, all device labels, regardless of their UDI status, need to have dates represented, expiration date, manufacturing date being the two that we talk about primarily, in the standardized date format, which again is that 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day, and day must always be there. And we'll touch a little bit more on that later on. So that's really it on the UDI regulation. Hopefully everyone is again familiar with it and is working on their own implementation. So what I'd like to do is to shift gears a little bit and talk more, as I said in the beginning, about the infrastructure issues and other issues that have arisen that are not, again, I would argue, directly related to UDI, but have become a focus of activity as manufacturers have begun to develop and implement their own UDI solutions. So what we've seen, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these issues, but a lot of manufacturers have grown by acquisition. So they've got multiple systems, multiple SOPs, multiple ERPs, PLMs, and UDI often necessitates really a much more centralized approach. So there's a need to really centralize the data and how it is developed and managed. So this requires potentially some IT infrastructure changes, which I'm sure everyone realizes are not trivial. So again, some of this has a long lead time, and though not directly related to UDI, really is required to robustly implement UDI. We've seen a lot of challenges with how SKU numbers or part numbers or catalog numbers or whatever you call it are developed and maintained. And if there are not good procedures and well-controlled processes in place to manage SKU numbers, it becomes very, very difficult then to implement UDI on top of a SKU number organizationally. So we see a lot of work, and I have another slide, I'll touch on it briefly. We see a lot of activity in UDI around, again, what is not inherently a UDI issue, but around SKU rationalization. What are all these SKUs? Why are we assigning multiple SKUs to the same product? What are these activities? Why have they been done? And how can we wrap our arms around it in order to make some sense out of UDI? We also see, because people are needing to change the label, right, to typically make space or add a UDI compliant barcode, that there are lots of other label changes going on. Many manufacturers choose to rebrand products or change addresses or do all sorts of other things, which again is perfectly reasonable, but adds to the timeline and expense of UDI implementation. The UDI rule very intentionally is flexible. There's a lot of different types of manufacturers, a lot of different device types out there, so the rule essentially provides what I consider to be sort of the four corners of what UDI should be, leaving the flexibility for implementation up to manufacturers, which is great, assuming you're comfortable with a bit of ambiguity. Some are or some are not. So it really takes some understanding of the intent of the rule. We talked about that a bit, and how that applies to your products to really understand the best path forward, right? There is not a simple 1, 2, 3 paint by numbers approach here. This is really a much more systemic activity. And sort of building on that, we do see, obviously, at least initially, a focus on UDI as a regulatory activity. Obviously, in order to be compliant and continue to ship products, you need to be compliant. But there are a lot of benefits, so or potential benefits, both internally to the organization and to other stakeholders and customers. So we do really suggest and encourage clients, manufacturers, to reach out to their stakeholders, to reach out to their customers, to understand how they use the product, how they might use UDI, what kinds of issues or use cases or business cases could be helped through adequate identification through UDI and the data associated with it. So don't do this in a vacuum. Reach out and talk to folks and see what's going on. And in that same line, we see that some of the exceptions that are integral to the rule, and I won't really get into these, hopefully folks are familiar with them, may not necessarily align or support with how the devices are actually being distributed and used. The single-use device packaging exception might be a good example, where the UDI is on a shelf pack or carton with the understanding, actually explicit understanding, that that's where those devices are stored until they're used. But in fact, that may be what the manufacturer thinks or believes or hopes, but that's not really what's going on with their devices. So again, it really takes an understanding of specifically how those devices are being distributed and used to understand whether and how to take those exceptions. And finally, hopefully everyone understands that this UDI and the systemic implementation of UDI is a program, not a project. This is not going anywhere, so whatever you do, I hope that your executive leadership understands that and is supporting it at that level. Moving on to slide 16, a number of unexpected issues. Again, these are not inherently UDI issues. These are issues associated with our understanding of an organization, how it works, how it identifies products, and actually what those products are. I'm going to go into most of these in some detail in subsequent slides, so I'm not going to touch on them right now, but I think it's a pretty good overview of the kinds of issues, and I encourage you to take a look at this list and understand it as it relates to your organization and to your products. Moving on to slide 17, back to this issue of what do you produce. The first question we ask, and hopefully in your own organization you've asked the same question, what are all the active SKUs that we have? What are all the finished medical devices and accessories and components of those finished medical devices that we distribute in the United States? And that often is a very, very difficult task for manufacturers. So you need to get your arms around that and have data associated with that. You need to know, how did it get on the market? What is its pre-market path? What is its product code? You need to be able to line all this data up. It will be necessary when you get to good ID submissions, but it's also necessary to understand when UDI is applicable, which compliance deadline, and which exceptions can you take advantage of, because they can be limited by a product code, as you can see listed there. In subsequent slides, we're going to talk about components and accessories and spare parts, one of our favorite topics. But you can see there in the end of this slide a number of other issues that have come up, particularly with combination products that may have been approved, say, through the Center for Drugs, so it has an NDA. It may not be clear then what the device component is if it doesn't have an independent product code or an independent path to market. You need to understand, determine, document one way or another, what is the applicable compliance timeline for that device constituent part of that combination product. It may require a conversation with FDA. So again, these are long lead time items, and if you have any products in this category, be sure to start thinking about how that's going to work. The next couple slides I'm going to talk about component parts and accessories and spare parts as an extension. This is the statutory definition or pieces of the statutory definition of medical device. What I want to draw your attention to here in the bold, obviously, is that a medical device includes, or the definition of medical device includes, the concept of component parts and accessories. That is, component parts or accessories are in and of themselves medical devices, and therefore are subject to UDI. So understand that unlike some other countries, and we'll touch on this in a moment, where the definition of medical device might be a little bit different, the definition of medical in the U.S. includes the concepts of components and accessories. And again, they are themselves considered medical devices and therefore subject to all, actually, FDA regulations, including UDI. And in order to help us out in this, the CDRH and CBER, as you can see there, published recently a draft guidance on medical device accessories. And this is a very, very useful document to understand whether or not the things you are distributing are in fact accessories. And it defines essentially that accessories do one or more of three things. They either support, supplement, or augment the performance of a parent device. And again, you really need to get a copy of the guidance, the draft guidance. If you don't, read it, understand it, and apply it to your accessories to understand whether or not the things that you are distributing are in fact accessories to finished medical devices, and therefore are medical devices in and of themselves, and therefore subject to UDI. You then have to determine how is that device on the market, what is its pre-market path, is there a potential that it has an independent path, Class 1 exempt for example, or is it under or subsumed, which is kind of the default condition, subsumed under whatever the parent device's clearance or approval was. And that will then drive, of course, the timeline associated with that product. So if the accessory is part of a Class 2 510K, then it's going to follow the timeline associated with that 510K, and you need to line all that up both in terms of product code and whatever its path to market is. Now, as a corollary to that, not everything that's used with a medical device is an accessory. And this is the distinction and difference and process that manufacturers need to understand and put in place for themselves. So you can see part of that came out of the draft guidance there, a discussion that not everything that's used with just because it's used with the device is an accessory. So that's FDA saying that not everything is an accessory. You can see there a document that's from the European Commission, not a final guidance that they put out on accessories. And again, they're talking about spare parts and the difference between spare parts and accessories. So this again is a distinction that is not new, right? You have been distributing these things probably for many years, but UDI forces us to take a step back to look at all of this stuff that is distributed and determine whether that stuff is an accessory or component and therefore subject to UDI, or it's something else, spare part, service part, whatever you want to call it, and therefore not a medical device and therefore subject to UDI. And again, this is a process that you need to put in place and document and determine for yourself how this is going to work. And for some, this is not an issue. For some manufacturers, they don't have anything in this space. This is not a big deal. And for others, this is a huge undertaking. So if you're in the latter category, then hopefully you've started this process already. One of the other interesting issues that has come to light as UDI has started to roll is this notion of labeler and who is the labeler. So in the UDI final rule, the organization that was responsible for UDI, that is both putting a UDI on the label, as we can see here, and submitting data to the good ID, is the labeler. Labeler is a term that CDRH borrowed from CDER, the Center for Drugs, and if you look at drug registration and listing, you can see that labeler has been used for a very long time. Labeler code is something that is part of the NDC. The labeler is the person who submits that listing information to CDER. And in the same way, manufacturers too broad a concept from a UDI perspective, too ambiguous, I would say, and broad a concept within the U.S. to talk about who is the labeler or who is responsible for UDI. So we have this concept of labeler. There are two concepts that I think are important to keep in mind, and labeler affects a lot of activities. So if you are on one or the other side of contract manufacturing or private labeling, you need to be sure that each party, assuming there's only two, understands who is going to be responsible for putting the UDI on the label, whose UDI is that going to be, and who is going to actually collect and submit the data to the good ID. In most situations, or in fact I would argue probably in all situations, one party will never have all of the data. So there's going to be a need for people to work together to collect the data and submit the data. There are two concepts I want to come back to when we talk about labeler, and you see it in definitions OUS that I think are useful, and in the definition of labeler. There's two concepts that come into play. One is whose name is on the product. Now, I'm not talking about the little manufacturing plant symbol with who manufactured the product that we see OUS primarily. I'm talking about whose name is on the label. If I pick up the device and I look at it, what do I see? Whose name is associated with that product? There's typically somebody who is. And that person is often the person who's causing that device to be put into commercial distribution. I'm not saying they're physically doing it themselves, but they're the one that's causing it to be. The product gets ordered through that company, and that company then is sending that product out or sending it to their distributors for further distribution. So when we look at those two ideas of own name and commercial distribution, I believe those are the two issues that you have to look at and understand in order to determine who is the labeler for any given device, given what are often fairly complex relationships in the contract manufacturing and private label space. Whatever you do in this space, make sure that you document this in whatever contract or supplier or quality agreement, whatever you have, make sure that everybody understands very specifically who has what responsibility, and make sure that's understood very clearly moving forward. Again, this can be a very long lead time item, so I encourage you, if you haven't already, to start identifying who these players are and start those conversations to understand what this is going to look like moving forward. The other issue that we talk about is really how your products are actually labeled and packaged. One of the issues that comes up, and again, hopefully everyone understands that the UDI goes on the label of the device. Label is a regulatory concept. Label is where other regulatory information goes. So hopefully everyone knows where their label is, what that looks like, and that's where UDI goes. This is not just a supply chain activity. We often hear folks talk about the orderable unit or the shippable unit. I'll just put the UDI on the shippable unit. Well, no, these are not concepts that you're going to see anywhere in the UDI rule. They talk about the label, goes on the label, and as you put that device into higher levels of packaging, you will put a UDI on those higher levels of packaging. So be sure that you understand where the label is, what that looks like, and that's where UDI goes, as well as the higher levels of packaging, however you decide to manage that. And again, on standardized date format, understand that this is an additional requirement that happens to also be in the UDI rule. It goes on all device labels, all levels, regardless of whether you're subject to UDI or any particular packaging level is subject to UDI. Everything needs to be in that standardized date format. There are, as I mentioned before, a lot of exceptions in the rule. I encourage you to understand these, understand the intent of them, understand how your products are actually being distributed and used, to understand whether or not that you're really in a position to take advantage of these exceptions. Many of them are very useful and very powerful when they're properly used. We've talked about combination products. Hopefully everyone understands, if you're in that space, you've got to understand how this product is identified and how the constituent parts are to understand which space you fit in. Are you over in sort of the pharma space? Are you in the device space, or maybe a little bit of both? And DSCSA has given us a couple of wrinkles. So if you make combination kits, medical procedure kits that have pharmaceuticals in them, I encourage you to understand both the DSCSA as well as the UDI requirements and understand whether you may in fact have responsibility in both of those spaces. I want to touch briefly on convenience kits because this is can be quite an interesting issue. And to take a half a step back, the idea behind the convenience kit exception, which if you put a UDI on the kit, then you don't need to put a UDI on the individual components of the kit. So again, it's a very, very powerful tool. The idea though was that that everything within that kit is consumed in that one clinical experience. So let's think about a suture removal kit, right? It comes in, it's all sterile and packaged. A clinician opens that up, uses what they need to, and then discards everything from there. So UDI on a kit is sufficient to provide the identification and support the traceability of that kit over its entire life cycle. The manufacturer knows what went into that kit, so if somebody needed to recall a component, they would know which of the kits had that recall component in it. If someone needed to report a problem, they opened up the kit, something was missing or broken or what have you, they would have the UDI of the kit right there available. If your kit does not work that way, if the components are not consumed or discarded within that one event, the opening of that kit, if these components have a life outside that kit, then you need to reconsider the use of the kit exception and the identification of the components within that kit. So again, it's important to document and understand each of the exceptions, and there's discussion and criteria of them both in the rule and the preamble, and understand that as you move forward and if you decide to take advantage of any of the exceptions that are integral to the rule. In the same way, there is an additional requirement for direct marking. So in addition to the label requirement that we've already talked about, for those devices that are intended to be reused and reprocessed between patient use, there needs to be a UDI on the device itself. So there are some devices for which the label can also act as a direct mark. So you need to understand the difference between these and how they overlap. More importantly, you need to understand what is a reprocessed device. So not everything that is reused is necessarily a reprocessed device that is subject to the direct mark requirement of the regulation. This is all information taken out of existing FDA guidance documents, but I think the critical point about a reprocessed device is that it is reprocessed in order to be used on a subsequent patient. So hopefully everyone understands that I clean or I disinfect or I sterilize a device after one patient so that it can be available for use on a subsequent patient. That is the notion, if you will, even the definition of what is a reprocessed device. So if you have a device that fits into this category, then it's subject to direct marking, and you need to also apply the direct marking requirements of the rule. And one of the other issues that has come up, and again, maybe this one we might argue or could argue is more UDI related, but each of the accredited issuing agencies, each of the standards agencies require that you have a quality barcode, a barcode quality of grade C or better. And even those manufacturers who have been using the standards for some time, we have found many of them have never actually graded their barcode. They don't actually have a barcode verifier. They have scanned the barcode, and if they get an appropriate answer out of the scanner, then they're satisfied. But that's what standards of these organizations say. So it is incumbent upon you to follow the standards or guidelines of the accredited issuing agency you have decided to use. So if you use GS1 or HIBIC or ICC-BBA, whichever one you're using, you have to follow the rules of that organization. That's the concept of accredited issuing agency. And therefore, as I said before, all of them require a barcode grade C or better. You might find actually some contracts that you have with customers might actually require a higher grade, grade B, say. The only way to know that you have a quality barcode is to have a barcode verifier. There's nothing new here. This has been going on for a very long time. There's a tremendous amount of information out there about barcode verification. There's a lot of suppliers out there. So if you search for barcode verifier, you will find plenty of people in the space. But it needs to be done on all of your labels, either 100% or through your sampling plan. But all of your labels, all of your UDI labels need to have a quality barcode. It needs to both have both needs to have quality, and it needs to be decoded to assure that you have the correct information that's in it. Again, if you have any questions, please let us know. And finally, we're kind of wrapping up here because I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. But hopefully everyone understands that the Good ID requires a set of metadata to be submitted. Again, the Global Unique Device Identification Database. It's not GoodID, it's Good ID. But there's a number of fields there that people may not have really used before or are not familiar with. So if you're not familiar with DUNS, Dun & Bradstreet numbers, that's critical, central to the whole operation of the database. So you need to understand your DUNS numbers and be able to identify one associated with your label. You need to understand how certain of these fields are used. Model version, for example, is a regulatory concept, and you need to be very clear that if that changes, you're creating a new device identifier and a new Good ID record. So take some time to understand the attributes, where this information is. You'll find probably that a lot of the information doesn't exist discretely anywhere. It's on the label. You're going to have to go to the label. If you've got, for example, storage and handling conditions associated with a product, it may not exist discretely anywhere. You're going to have to go get a label and read it off the label and enter it into whatever tool you're using to collect the data. I also want to draw your attention to the term optional, which is used in the Good ID guidance. And some of the fields really are optional. Catalog number, for example, is optional. If you want to put data in, fine. If you don't, that's fine. Some of them are actually conditionally required. So if you have information on your label, clinically relevant size, storage conditions, then the guidance says this, maybe it wasn't noticed, but if it's on the label, then it needs to be reflected in the database as well. So some of the fields that are called optional, again, are really conditionally required. And if you haven't started this process, we encourage you to do so. So finally, some things to think about. We've touched really only on the UDI part of this. There are a number of conforming amendments, changes made to other regulations to incorporate UDI. So you need to not only, in my next slide, I'll touch on those in a minute, so hold on a second. But I think we've touched on most of these other issues as well, your exceptions, make sure people are trained, you've updated your SOPs, all of that kind of basic activity. And finally, I touched briefly before on this notion of audit. Is something you should do once you have developed and implemented your UDI solution. Make sure that you are clear that it's actually meeting the intent and letter of the UDI regulation. So if you need any help with that, please let us know. We do that as well. And again, here's the list of the conforming amendments. Again, changes made to other regulations. So as UDI rolls out and you have adverse event reports that you're submitting, MDRs, then UDI needs to be part of that. Recalls will be done at a UDI level, which means now your complaint systems need to start collecting UDI. All of those activities that are happening at a device-specific level need to happen at a UDI level. And there's a very good information on FDA's website if you're confused about what these conforming amendments mean. So let me summarize here. Hopefully everyone understands. UDI requires a solid foundation, not just kind of a IT infrastructure, but how you manage devices, how you identify devices. That needs to be really well understood so that you can then build your UDI program on top of that. Again, program, not project. We talked about accessories and components and spare parts and all of that, understanding what you actually distribute what that looks like, how that works is critical to understanding how UDI is going to be applied to your products. We talked about labeler, which can be a challenge in some cases. We've seen some people pushing back on both sides. So again, start early to have that conversation. We talked about direct marking. We've talked about barcode verification. And finally, a lot of activity really around the good ID, the collection, normalization, validation of the data elements. And then finally how that's going to get submitted. So a lot of activity there, and encourage you to start if you haven't. And finally, we touched on the conforming amendments and all the changes that need to be made to other SOP systems, training that needs to take place in order to make sure that everyone is managing device identification at a UDI level moving forward, and for those things that are happening at a device identification level. Finally, there is the 7th annual. It's hard to believe that we've done 7 of these, but the UDI conference, which has been going on for a long time. It's a great conference. It's where really when I was at FDA, we spent a lot of time working through issues, hearing, letting people hear what FDA was thinking, and hearing from people about what was going on and the issues and problems that they were having. So it's a great venue, has been a great venue. I expect this one to be as well. We will be there. Lots of people will be there. So we encourage you, please, if you have an interest in UDI and you want to hear what's going on or you want to talk to people, please join us here in Baltimore. It's beautiful that time of year, and we look forward to seeing you then. And with that, Jim, I know I didn't leave a whole lot of time, but I'd like to open it up to any questions that folks might have.
Great. Thanks, Jay. We really appreciate it. As I move through the questions, I'm going to try and get those that are most general, most easy to answer, and as Jay always tells me, to really understand the product and processes in order to answer the question, but also make sure that the person answering the question has the sufficient information to institutionalize the answer are important steps. So we are concerned that in some cases these answers become applied to companies who didn't ask them and they don't get applied correctly. So I will try and go through the most general and the quickest ones first. An easy one is, are shipping crates exempt from UDI?
So in the rule, there's a exception and a definition of shipping container. And I would encourage you to understand the intent here. So at some point, as you move up the packaging hierarchy, you get to a point where you're essentially no longer homogeneous. You have a pallet or you have a tote, right? You're taking 2 of these and 4 of those and you're putting it together to meet a particular order. At that point, you're at in what we would consider to be a shipping container, and at that point, UDI is no longer relevant. But again, I would encourage you to read the definition in the rule and the exception to understand whether what you're calling a shipping crate, I think was the word, is in FDA terms a shipping container. But yes, in general is the answer.
Okay. Another general question is the question, where can I find combination product specific guidelines? And the more general question might be, what should a pharma company do to really evaluate if it has to put UDI on any devices it might be selling, and vice versa? What might a medical device company need to do to determine if it needs to put UDI type identification on any of its devices?
It's a great question. There is, from an identification perspective, not a lot of information out there about combination products. Hopefully everyone realizes a combination product is a different animal, right? It's not a drug or device. It is a combination product. But what ends up happening is that the combination product tends to follow one center or another. So it's primarily regulated as a drug or a device or what have you. And in that way, it typically has an identifier of that center. So if it's regulated primarily as a drug, that combination product might have an NDC. which is fine, but the device constituent part is still subject to UDI. So if you have a combination product, and there's some subtleties in the rule about this, but in general, if you have a combination product, it has an NDA, it's regulated as a drug, it has an NDC number on it, and you've got this separate device component that is part of this combination product, well, that separate device component needs its own UDI. So if you are particularly a pharma company that hasn't maybe been focused on UDI, and you do have combination products, I encourage you to understand the devices that are within it and understand that in fact those devices are most likely subject to UDI. It's a little bit easier on the flip side if you're a device company that maybe is putting a drug into say a procedure kit. It's a little bit more straightforward from a UDI perspective because typically that kit has a UDI on it, and the device constituent parts are exempt. Again, you've got to kind of look at DSCSA to understand whether how that drug component should be identified and whether it's also subject to DSCSA.
Okay. Another what appears to be easy question. I'm sure the words "it depends" will come, but very simply, can you clarify if the power cords specifically are going to require a UDI?
I cannot. It depends. These are decisions that there is no list of things there are some product codes that do identify specific accessories. So there are some where we can look at it and go, okay, that Phantom or what have you, that it has its own product code, therefore we can understand that that is a device accessory. For the other 98% of the products that are out there, it's a decision that really each manufacturer needs to make. They need to look at the draft guidance and determine and document whether the piece part or whatever it is in fact an accessory, and therefore subject to UDI, and therefore a medical device and subject to UDI. I wish there was an easier way to do that, but there really isn't. And I think for different companies, they'll rightfully come to different decisions. But again, we encourage you to have a process, have criteria, document your decisions, and maybe at some point somebody may not agree with your decision, but at least you made a conscious decision and you documented it, and maybe someone needs to change in the future. Do keep in mind, particularly if you're a global distributing products globally, what this is going to look like globally, how that's going to work, and some of the definitions and issues that arise globally as well. Okay,
we started 2 minutes late, so I think we can go 2 minutes over. Also with regard to product codes, the question is that some devices were cleared under product codes that are no longer used or have changed in the device listing after clearance. Must we use the original product code assigned at clearance? Which product code should be used?
I would suggest you use the most current product code associated with that product. The same is true actually for almost anything. You might have multiple 510Ks that moved along the evolution of a device. We encourage you to use the 510K that allows that particular device to be on the market, which typically is the most recent. And in the same way, I would suggest using the most recent product code that represents that product.
Okay, a couple of quick ones. Do you know when the Good ID will be available for Class 2 devices?
No.
Any guess?
I would guess. Maybe after the next wave, so potentially October, November. So after the FDASIA devices, potentially then, or it might be more of a early winter, January, February of next year.
Okay.
But I don't have any further insight.
Is there guidance on minimum font size? on labels for human readable?
We get this question a lot, and FDA does not provide any guidance on minimum font size. There are some other documents that talk about legibility, not UDI related and not particularly related to font. There are some U.S. documents that talk about font size, but no, there is no, FDA doesn't have any minimum font size that drives the concept of legibility.
Okay. You talked a lot about labeler and assignment of labeler among the parties that may be in the supply chain. The specific question is, can responsibility for UDI be changed by contract?
Sure. I mean,
as long as both parties agree to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I mean, there are some practical implications, right? So if company A is putting their UDI on the product and then it switches over to company B, you're going to have to create a new record in the good ID, right? It's going to have to go under someone else's account, those kinds of things. But from a practical perspective, FDA doesn't, hasn't weighed in saying one way or another. Someone has to be responsible. Yes, I see no reason why, if both parties agree, that things couldn't change. But again, I think the contract or whatever document you have that describes that relationship is the best place to describe in gory detail how this is going to work. We're particularly concerned about changes that, say, an OEM might make and whether those are being conveyed appropriately to the labeler, again, assuming the labeler is not the OEM. And so, make sure that everyone understands that, that some of these things might have significant implications from a UDI perspective moving forward.
Okay, we'll just do two more. The one question is, there's a glass vial packed in a tray with a Tyvek seal. There's currently no label on the vial. Do we need to add a label to the vial? As
Jim mentioned, I'm hesitant to answer the question in the specific. I will answer it in the abstract, though, which is to say, and that's why I talked about label before. In general, the UDI goes on the label of the device. If there is no label, then there is no requirement. There is no place to put the UDI. So in general, UDI never intended to change the way manufacturers label and package their products. It simply, if you will, was adding UDI to the already existing label where the other regulatory information resides. Now, whether there should have been a label on there in the first place, I don't know. Is there something about the way that product is actually distributed and used that maybe would warrant, reasonably warrant its own label? I'm not sure. But in general, again, if there is no label, the UDI regulation did not intend to create a mandate that somebody put a label on a product that didn't have a label there in the first place.
Okay. And the last question has to do with shipping replacements as part of a service repair agreement after the September deadline without a UDI. Can a customer-owned device be returned, repaired, and reshipped to the customer without a UDI?
Wow. We'd probably need to get in the weeds on this one a bit more, but in general, commercial distribution is a broad concept. It's not limited to new products, and I hope I'm on the right tangent here, Jim. So even refurbishing, remanufactured, it doesn't make any difference. Any product that you're putting, whether you're loaning that product, whether you're selling that product, whether you're sending that product, you're selling it to somebody else because it's been refurbished, at that point, you're most likely triggering the need for UDI. But again, that's something you've got to look at your own. We would have to look. I would have to look at SOPs and what's actually happening to determine whether, when and where and if UDI is applicable. But just understand that commercial distribution is a broad concept and potentially includes remanufacturing, refurbishing, and a number of other activities as well.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's patience. We did go a little over. If we didn't get to your question, there's about a dozen left, so it would go on for quite a while. But please visit our website. You can reach out to us. Just as a reminder, Jay and his team are doing strategic and regulatory consulting. We're also running projects for clients to become UDI and DSCSA compliant. And our historical presence, we've also done quite a bit of staff supplementation work. So depending on how your company best sees the way of staffing and moving forward with regard to UDI, we think we're quite flexible to work with you. Jay, do you have any last comments?
I don't, Jim. I'd just like to thank everyone for their time and attention. Appreciate the constant kind of communication that we have around UDI. Encourage folks to chat amongst yourselves or with us if you've got any questions or issues or just an observation. Please let us know. As I said in the beginning, we're all learning here. This is an evolving space, and hopefully we're all getting this right. And with that, I hopefully will see some of you in Baltimore at the end of June. And I'd just like to, again, thank everyone for their time and attention here this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jay, and thank you all for attending. Have a good day.
Have a good